All right, today we are tackling a massive topic, World War II. It's the largest, deadliest conflict in all of human history. So let's get right into it. Because honestly, to understand the world we live in now, you have to understand the sheer, unbelievable scale of this war.
Just look at this number, 60 to 80 million. I mean, just pause for a second and try to wrap your head around that.
That's the best estimate we have for the human cost. And what's even more staggering is that number includes up to 55 million civilians. That devastation is exactly why we need to dig in and understand how something like this could ever happen.
So where does a story this big even begin? Well, World War II didn't just pop up out of nowhere. You can draw a straight line right back to the end of the First World War. In a lot of ways, one war just planted the seeds for the next.
See, after World War I, Europe was a mess, and in Germany, things were especially bad. There was this deep, simmering anger over the Treaty of Versailles, which basically forced Germany to take all the blame and pay these crippling debts. Then, you throw the Great Depression on top of that economic chaos, well, you've got the perfect storm for extremist ideas to take hold.
And this is the kind of ideology that took root. As early as 1923, Adolf Hitler wrote this in his book, Mein Kampf. This wasn't just some political ambition. It was a blueprint for a violent, racist worldview, one that was aimed at nothing less than extermination. The warning signs, they were there, plain as day, long before any shots were fired.
And once he got into power, Hitler moved fast. I mean, chillingly fast. He tore down Germany's democracy, started secretly building up the military, which was a huge violation of the Versailles Treaty, and began his push for Lebensraum, or living space for Germans. And as he's making alliances with fascist Italy and an expansionist Japan, he starts gobbling up territory. Austria, Czechoslovakia, and for the most part, the rest of the world just watched, because everyone was terrified of starting another war.
Okay, so that brings us to the war itself. In the beginning, it was all about the absolutely breathtaking speed and success of the Axis powers. The world was truly on the brink.
This is the date it all kicks off, September 1st, 1939. Hitler had just made a shocking non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, basically ensuring he wouldn't have to fight a war on two fronts. So he invades Poland, and that was the final straw. Britain and France had to honor their promise to defend Poland. They declared war, and just like that, World War II had begun in Europe.
So, how did Germany manage to conquer so much so fast? The answer is this word: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Forget the miserable, static trench warfare of World War I. This was all about speed and overwhelming force. You use waves of tanks and aircraft to punch a massive hole in the enemy's defenses, cause total chaos, and just shatter their ability to fight back.
And it was brutally effective. Poland was caught in a vice, the German Blitzkrieg from the west, and then, just a few weeks later, a Soviet invasion from the east. It was crushed with absolutely devastating speed.
And they didn't stop there. German forces then just swept across Western Europe. France had built this supposedly impenetrable line of defenses called the Maginot Line. The Germans, they just went around it, made it completely useless. By June of 1940, German troops were marching into Paris. France, one of the world's great powers, had surrendered.
With France out of the fight, Hitler set his sights on Great Britain. But to launch a land invasion, he needed to control the skies first. What followed became known as the Battle of Britain. And against all odds, the Royal Air Force fought off the German Luftwaffe and won. It was a heroic defense that forced Hitler to call off his invasion. Britain stood alone, but it was still standing.
So those early years of the war, they really belonged to the Axis powers. But that kind of dominance couldn't last forever, right? The momentum was about to shift, and it was going to shift in a big way. Everything was about to change.
And you can see it all happening right here. In December 1941, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor drags the industrial giant of the United States into the war. Just 6 months later, the U.S. Navy scores a decisive victory at the Battle of Midway, turning the tide in the Pacific. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Germans suffer a catastrophic, unbelievable defeat at Stalingrad. It was a disaster they never fully recovered from. And then, of course, you have D-Day, the massive Allied invasion that opened up the Western Front and began the push toward Berlin.
And to really get a sense of the scale of that final turning point, look at this number: 156,000. That's how many Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy in a single day. It was, and still is, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Just incredible.
So the tide had turned. The end of the war was finally in sight. But getting there would come at a staggering cost.
and the war would end in a way that nobody on Earth could have ever imagined.
As the Allies pushed from the west and the Soviets closed in from the east, the Nazi regime just crumbled. Hitler took his own life in his bunker, and about a week later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. And while Europe celebrated, you have to remember, the war wasn't over. In the Pacific, it was still raging.
Which led to this absolutely terrible choice facing the new US President, Harry Truman. Option A, invade mainland Japan. The military planners told him it would cost a horrific number of lives, both American and Japanese, maybe millions. Or, option B, use a brand new, top-secret weapon with a destructive power that was almost unimaginable. Truman made his decision. On August 6th, the first atomic bomb fell on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second one was dropped on Nagasaki. The destruction was total. Just days after that, Japan announced it would surrender unconditionally. World War II was finally over.
You know, after all that fighting, the world fell silent. And in that silence, out of all that rubble, a new world had to be built. One that was forever changed by the war's legacy. And this chart tells you one of the most tragic truths about this war. Look at the numbers. The vast majority of people who died were not soldiers. They were civilians. It completely changed the face of modern warfare.
And the war's aftermath was just immense. At the heart of that unimaginable human cost was the Holocaust, the systematic, state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jewish people. In reaction to atrocities like that, the world tried to find a new way forward. You had the Nuremberg trials, which set the precedent that people could be held accountable for war crimes. You had the creation of the United Nations to try and prevent future wars. And you had a total shift in who held power in the world.
Because Europe wasn't the center of the universe anymore. All the power was now in the hands of two new rival superpowers with totally opposite ideologies, the United States and the Soviet Union. The same alliance that won the war almost immediately fell apart, and that kicked off the next great global conflict, the Cold War.
And all of this brings us to one final, really important question. The war redrew the map of the world. It created new alliances, and it brought us into the nuclear age. So when you look at the world today, it really forces you to ask, have we truly learned the lessons that were paid for with tens of millions of lives?